Hey, it's Rachel. It is January and I'm filming downstairs in my basement office. After my recent video about how I use the greenhouse you can probably see through the window behind me as a root cellar during the winter, I had a few comments asking me to do more content around the preservation and storage of food. Typically I focus only on growing food, but I thought I would try and address that request. I do preserve food 5 different ways, including freeze drying, and I know that freeze drying was a topic of particular interest. So I'll devote a bit of extra time to that topic, but let me go through all 5 ways that I do preserve food. I'll start with the easiest of these 5 methods, which is to simply store things in the ground outdoors through the winter. This is possible with my more cold hardy herbs like rosemary, parsley, thyme, and sage, as well as cold hardy greens such as spinach, chard, lettuce, mustard, and arugula. I can also store beets and carrots directly in the ground. I showed in my last video how I use a thick layer of leaves combined with our natural snowfall in the winter to insulate the ground and prevent it from freezing. I can then push those layers back to harvest things like carrots whenever my family wants them. In my opinion, the second easiest way to store things is with a root cellar. The nice thing about root cellaring is you are just taking advantage of the earth's natural temperature through the winter. There are, however, 4 things to keep in mind to make this work properly. The first is you do need to properly cure all of these crops in order to have them be ready for storage and to hold up well. The second is that you will need to create different microclimates within your root cellar. Not all crops need the same things. They have different needs as far as humidity and temperature ranges. You're going to want to make sure that you can establish those different microclimates inside your root cellar to keep everything in storage for as long as possible. My winter squashes, like butternut or spaghetti squash, are stored here. They're close to this window, and heat bleeds through there, making this one of the warmer areas of the greenhouse. With moderate humidity, it's great for those squash. Onions need cooler temperatures, but also just moderate humidity. I suspend those in mesh bags from a hook there. These ones are from the grocery store. I've already used up my onions from the garden, but even the ones that I purchase, I will still suspend and hang down here because the cold temperature and good airflow keeps them longer than if I kept them in my pantry. And then my potatoes and sweet potatoes go in this enclosed area with the insulation. I'll link to that video if you want the details. But my root crops that need really cold and very damp environments are stored here in the area underneath the shelving where it is nice and cold against a solid wall of dirt outside. And I put them in damp packing material to give them the humidity that they need. The sheets of insulation then hold that humidity well inside. No matter what microclimate you're using, you're going to need to ensure that there's adequate ventilation to prevent spoilage of the crops. They do have a bit of ventilation, just to be clear, coming through the slats of wood underneath and through the handhold/air gap that I've left carved at the top there. So they do get ventilation, but they are held in a much higher humidity environment. And fourth and last, you will want to come in and check this pretty often. It can be easy to have a sort of set it and forget it mindset when it comes to a root cellar space. In my case, it's attached to my office and I still forget to go in there sometimes. If things do start to spoil, you'll want to get them out of there as soon as possible in order to prevent them further affecting other things that you're storing in the root cellar. But overall, I do love this approach. I think it's simple, low effort, and I like to do it as much as possible. It is not appropriate for a large number of crops, but for the ones that I can store this way, I do whenever possible. In the freeze drying section, I will mention how I had to store some of my root crops in a very different way this year, and you'll see why I used freeze drying for those applications. Canning is another method that I use on a regular basis. I used to can all of my tomatoes as either crushed tomatoes or as diced tomatoes with different seasoning blends. I have since shifted to largely freeze drying these, but I do still use my paste tomatoes in canning in a different way. I juice these tomatoes and I use that liquid to can meats as convenience foods. For example, I will take Italian sausage links and then pressure can them into this tomato juice along with some Italian seasonings. I similarly will take ground beef that I will pressure can in this tomato juice. That gives me a nice convenience food that I can pull out for a shortcut whenever I want to have chili or a beef-based pasta sauce. A lot of my berry harvest ends up as jam for our own consumption or to give away as Christmas gifts, and I can those in half-pint jars. I also make a jam with cherry tomatoes. Inevitably, I get one huge harvest in the fall right before our first frost is about to hit, and there's no way that I or my family can eat all of those fresh before they go bad. Instead, I use that last big harvest to make a savory tomato-herb jam. I cook that down until it's nice, dense, sweet, and kind of jammy, and then I can it in half-pint jars. That savory jam is really great as part of an appetizer platter with meats and cheeses, kind of a charcuterie situation. For that reason, it also makes a great Christmas gift. And I like to use it in our own meals. either mixed in with meatloaf or poured over meatballs as a really great quick dinner option. Moving on to the foods that I freeze, I don't have a ton of freezer space, and for that reason I have to be pretty selective about what goes in there. But one of the things my family does eat a ton of is broccoli. I mostly harvest this over time for fresh eating. I grow the Green Magic variety, and that gives a really nice extended harvest. But I am still getting side shoots as we head into winter, and the plants won't survive as we drop below 20 Fahrenheit or -7 Celsius. For that reason, I will often, at the end of the season, do a huge harvest, blanch that broccoli, freeze them in a single layer, and then bag them up and keep them in the freezer for later use. The second crop I freeze is beet greens. As I'm harvesting beets throughout the season, I will get a lot of fresh beet greens. Those are edible, and they're a wonderful second crop, but I typically can't eat them quickly enough to keep them from going bad. Some of them will go to the chickens, but wherever possible, I like to clean, chop, and then blanch those briefly in boiling water, get them really dry, and then form them into individual serving sizes that I then freeze and bag. Throughout the winter, whenever I want greens to throw into a soup that I'm making, I can grab one of those individual bundles and just toss it in. I will also turn some of our massive quantities of sunbird tromboncino squash into zoodles using my spiralizer. I then freeze those in individual serving sizes similar to the beet greens, and I use those as a grain-free alternative to pasta throughout the year. Moving on to freeze drying, because I know this was a topic of interest. I did invest in a freeze dryer last year. It was not a casual purchase. I was asked whether I thought freeze drying was worth it. Personally, I do, and I'll show you why. You'll see as I go through this that I use my freeze dryer to do things that in many cases I really couldn't do any other way. First example is that I freeze dry things that I might want to pulverize and use as a powder. Now I generally prefer to freeze dry tomatoes rather than can them because I can leave the skins on this way. That makes it much easier than canning, and the skins have much of the nutrition. Plus, the real benefit here is that I can reconstitute that powder in a 1-to-1 equal ratio between water and tomato powder to get a nice rich tomato paste. Alternatively, I can mix this paste in a 1-to-2 ratio with water to get more of a crushed tomato consistency, or a 1-to-4 ratio to have an even thinner consistency of a tomato juice that I can use for canning my meats. I can also leave the powder as is, and I mix it into some of my spice rubs that I would use on, as an example, brisket or barbecue chicken or something like a pot roast in the slow cooker, and it really gives a rich tomato flavor to things that I could not get any other way than with a powder. And as a final benefit, it takes up much less space in my storage area to have tomato powder than it would to have an equivalent amount of tomatoes canned as a crushed puree, and I am running out of space as it is. If I similarly turn freeze-dried berries into powder, I can mix that into a chia pudding or use it in homemade ice cream. I can also mix the dried berries directly into muffin batter or oatmeal as I'm preparing it. I can also rehydrate the berries in the fridge ahead of time and add them to things like morning yogurt. The second way that I use the freeze dryer is for crops that tend to come in large waves. Things like peppers that all come on in late summer, or summer squash for my tromboncino vines that just always is coming in incessantly. I slice up the peppers, freeze dry them, and then vacuum seal those jars. I found that 1-quart jar holds enough for a family-sized recipe. I already mentioned turning the summer squash into zoodles, but I also shred some of that, freeze dry it, and then store it in Mylar bags for use in baked goods all through the year. This is a case where I could just freeze those crops, but that would mean having a much larger freezer that's drawing energy all year. I'd much rather run the freeze dryer once and then store those crops on the shelf, requiring no additional energy and no additional utility bill for me. The third way that I use my freeze dryer, forgive the clip art here, but it's to rescue spoiled root crops. Before I figured out the root cellar greenhouse solution, I was storing potatoes in very suboptimal conditions and they were all starting to sprout. You can potatoes at home, but I don't like the finished texture. And rather than lose all of those potatoes, I bit the bullet, sliced them, blanched them, and freeze-dried them in slices that I can then pour out as needed to rehydrate and cook. Now with my sweet potatoes, unfortunately voles found me this year for the first time ever, and they apparently love sweet potatoes. They absolutely decimated a good chunk of my sweet potato harvest. I completely lost about 1/3 of the crop, and some of the ones that I tried to save ultimately went to the chickens. But another 1/3, although they were damaged by voles, or by my own clumsiness in harvesting, they were still salvageable, and for those I cut off the damaged areas and then I peeled, cubed, blanched, and freeze-dried the remaining material in pieces that I can now rehydrate and cook whenever we want to eat sweet potatoes. I saved some of the fingerling-sized tubers to grow slips next year. For the remainder, I roasted and mashed them with cream, butter, cinnamon, and Parmesan, and I freeze-dried that as a convenience food that I can then easily rehydrate as a quick side dish. When I was showing the root cellar / greenhouse earlier, I mentioned I only have store-bought onions left in there, That's because the ones that I grew this year did not store well for me and they were starting to go soft. I decided to save those by caramelizing them. I sliced them up, put them in my crock pot overnight until they were nice and caramelized and brown. I then froze those and freeze-dried them, and I stored them in vacuum-sealed jars inside my pantry. I can toss them easily into recipes whenever I want some deep oniony flavor. The fourth and final way that I use the freeze dryer is to preserve things that I cannot safely can at home. One example is with our broccoli. As I mentioned, I do try to freeze most of it, but inevitably I have some florets that have started to open and are past their prime. They don't look great on a dinner plate. I will use that portion of the harvest to instead make soups, either a roasted broccoli soup or a broccoli and cheddar soup. Neither of those should be canned at home. For one, you get a weird texture when you try and can broccoli, and for another, there's no safe way to can anything with dairy in it, so the broccoli cheddar soup is definitely out. Instead, when I make that big batch of soup, I freeze a portion of it directly into my freeze dryer trays, freeze dry that, crumble it, and store it in vacuum sealed jars that are then available for me to have as a very quick lunch with the simple addition of some boiling water anytime I need a quick meal. As always, I hope that was helpful and interesting. I tried to go fairly succinctly through that so as not to make this overly long, but if there's anything I did not mention or if you have questions on anything I did say in here, please do post comments below and I will do my best to answer. I'm far from an expert on food preservation, so if there's any tips or tricks that you think I should have mentioned or that you would like to share, please do also put those in the comments. My next video will be a review of everything I harvested from the garden this year. Some of you may already know I have been tracking every gram that came out of the garden. I'm going to do a readout on the servings that came out of it, the total nutrition, as well as the retail price of groceries that I did not have to pay for this year because of everything I grew and preserved. I hope everybody had a wonderful gardening season and that your prep for next year is going well. Until next time, thanks.